All right, they tell me it is time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So let's talk code reviews. So I put this session together today because I fully believe, oh wait, can we get my presentation up there? Yeah, plugged in.
Back out and check display.
All right, here we go. So I put this presentation together today because I fully believe both of the implications up here on this screen. On the one hand, I believe that there is no more powerful tool that we have at our disposal in the entire software process than a good code review. I believe that it is the most powerful tool we have for training, for code quality, for reducing bug counts, for increasing maintainability, standardizing on our processes, so many other things. There is no more powerful tool that we have than a good code review. But at the same time, I also believe that the vast majority of time the people in here and all over are spending on code reviews is wasted time, or largely wasted time, because there are a lot of ideas, understandings, misunderstandings that we bring to the table about code reviews, what they're for, what they're about, or how we should go about them, that undermines the value we could get out of them. So that's what I want to talk about today. What are those misconceptions we're bringing to the table, and what should we be looking for? What makes up a good code review? And it might be significantly simpler than you think. But that's where we're going to be going. By way of introduction, though, my name is Joe Belisle, and my background, I've been doing this for about 11 years. Professionally, I started out as a Java developer, Postgres backend, but most of my career has been spent in the .NET stack. Until the last couple years, I've just been a full stack developer. The last couple years, I actually jumped ship on the dev side and became an automation automation lead. So that's been mostly the same, but a little bit of a change of pace. Fun change. So that's my professional background, but why am I talking about this today? What are my credentials there? And my primary credential is that I am a previous code review hater. I didn't see the point of them. We thought that they were completely worthless. And that is myself and the team that I was on at the time. We were supposed to be doing them, but we never did. We didn't bother because they were a complete waste of our time. But at one point, the senior on our team, Jeff, came to us in our retro and he said, hey, we're supposed to be doing these, and I think it would be good for us. So I want us to start doing code reviews. We all roundly rejected the idea as stupid. But we had a good manager at the time, Chris, and Chris said his policy was if somebody wants to try something and nobody has a good reason not to, we'll give it a go. So we time boxed it. We said for the next sprint, you cannot merge without a code review. And it was awful. It was a complete waste of our time. I'd get my code done, and I'm like, I'm ready to check in. I'm good. But now I have to sit around and wait for Jeff to review it because nobody else was doing them other than Jeff. And I'm like, I've already, I kind of checked it. And if I mess something up, that's what QA is for, right? Like, they'll find it. So this was a complete waste of my time. It validated all of my thoughts about how worthless code reviews were. We got to the end of that sprint, next retro, and Chris said, how'd it go? And we said it was awful, let's stop. So Jeff rightly points out, it was awful because nobody did it. So Chris says, all right, here's what's going to happen. For the next sprint, we're going to keep doing it, but now everybody has to put at least one comment on every other code review, which is a very management-y sounding solution to that problem, but it worked. And I would never suggest it long term, but man, did it work. Because here's what happened within days, not months, not weeks, days. Things changed significantly. See, I, at the time, was really bad about unit tests. As much as I didn't see the value in code reviews, I certainly didn't see the value in unit tests. To be clear, I don't want the hate mail, I've since changed my tune completely, but that's another talk. But I never wrote them. But Steve on my team was a stickler for unit tests, and I knew if I didn't write them, I was giving him his free comment, and I was going to have to write them anyway. So I might as well just do them now. Well, Steve, for his part, was terrible about naming things. Like, his code sometimes was just unreadable. You're like, I don't even know what this means. But he knew I was a stickler for that. And so rather than just checking in whatever random thing he came up with, he would say, Joe, come here, I can't think of something. We'd come up with a name, and he's not going to give me my free comment either. We go back to work, and we're just good. But it wasn't just the two of us. There were, I think, 5 of us on that team at the time. And all of our strengths began to shore up one another's weaknesses. Because we started to learn what other people were going to be expecting, and we started to write to those expectations. Not because I developed a checklist of what each of those people on my team was going to be looking for, but because as we did it, we saw the value. We came to understand why they were looking for those things and internalize those things. So I didn't have to actively pursue and say, okay, did I check off what she wanted? Did I get what he wanted? No, that's how I wrote my code. And as that happened with all of us, our code base became a lot more consistent, a lot more cohesive, and a lot easier to work in. Think about it. If you have 5 really good developers, and I'm not putting myself in that category at that time, but let's pretend a team of 5 really good developers, but each writes in a different way. Your code base might be objectively, like each part of it might be good, but it's going to be kind of hard to hop from feature to feature and work in the code that other people have done because they're doing it differently than you. But the more you kind of come to this cohesive understanding as a team of what you need to be doing, of what good code looks like, then you can dive right in because you've all have that shared same expectation. And here's the thing. If that was just the only time that I had seen that happen, I wouldn't be doing this presentation. One anomalous team is not a reason to put something together. The reality is I have seen this happen over and over again on multiple teams, at multiple companies, on teams where we're doing waterfall, and teams where we're doing Scrum. I've seen it on teams where we're doing premise work and web work. I've seen it now on the automation side of the house. Right? Every time that we have taken this seriously, we have seen the same kind of transformation at a team level, but also as individuals. And you see people grow in their understanding and their abilities well beyond their experience. And so I know that this is something any team could experience. So that's why we're talking about this today. And so here's what I got. Pretty simple structure. We are going to talk first, spend a good bit of time on misconceptions. Talking about what are the wrong ideas that we bring to the table about code reviews, because we need to understand these if we're going to recognize the implications that these misunderstandings are going to have on our process. Once we cover that, we'll move into what does a good code review look like? What priorities should we have? And I hope it is significantly more simple than you might think. And finally, we'll finish off with some just practical tips. But as I said, we're going to start with misconceptions, and we're going to spend a few minutes here. Because a lot of the ideas that people have about code reviews that kind of suck the value out of the process are not examined ideas. These aren't things that you've sat down and said, you know what, this is what I believe about this. You maybe have picked it up somewhere along the way, and when you just continue to ride forward with these unexamined ideas, you don't necessarily ever think about the impact that's going to have on the process. So this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the misconceptions I run into very often in the wild, and I wanted to address them today. And first and foremost, the idea that a code review is just a formality. If you believe that there is no value to be had in the code review process, guess what? You're not going to get any value out of the code review process. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're not putting anything into the process because you don't think there's any value to be had, and so you don't get any value out of it. And you just continue to step back, like I did that first sprint we had to do code reviews, and say, see, told you it was worthless. So if we are going to get value out of this process, first and foremost, we have to recognize there might actually be value to be had here. And we need to set aside the notion that just because somebody higher in the dev org said, hey, we got to do this, and check that checkbox in GitHub or TFS that says you can't merge without a code review, that doesn't mean it's a worthless formality. We've got to move past that. But let's assume that maybe you think there is some value. What about this one? that code reviews are mainly for senior developers to keep tabs on junior developers. Or you could put it a little more altruistically, that it's for training, right? You gotta help make sure they understand what they're doing, or maybe protect our code base a little bit from their misunderstandings. And there is truth and reality to this. I really believe that there is no better training mechanism than the code review process. But if you hold to this view, you are cutting yourself off from a lot of the feedback, right? We can give feedback one direction, but we're cutting ourselves off entirely from it the other direction. And it really goes along with this next one, that code reviews are important for less trustworthy developers, but not for me, right? Maybe you've got that person on your team and you're like, oh, I know who you're talking about. We can't let his code in without extra eyes on it. You ever think maybe you're that guy on your team? Here's the thing. The senior to junior one also, but this one especially, betrays a level of arrogance about your own abilities and your own experience that is entirely unjustified. I don't care how careful you are. I don't care how experienced you are. I don't care how good you are. You are still a human, and you will still make mistakes. There is still going to be a time that you leave that debug statement on some other class that accidentally got swept up in your changes and you just forgot to remove it. There's going to be a time that you were testing out what you were doing and you had a string literal that really needs to be in a config file so that you're not hard coding it, and you just forgot to move it over. There's going to be a time you misspell something and you need somebody to say, hey, by the way, bro, you messed that up. And that happens. It's not because you're inexperienced, not because you don't know what you're doing. It's just because we all make mistakes. We all need that feedback. And there's another kind of feedback we'll talk about in a bit, that honestly, the more experience you have, the more trustworthy you are, the more you need the feedback from the junior people on your team. But we'll talk about that later. But this one can cause trouble. I got called into my boss's office one time and reprimanded for the fact that I was telling the rest of the team that one of my fellow seniors on the team, his code wasn't trustworthy. And I was like, what? This is the first I'm hearing of this. Turns out it was because I had the audacity to suggest that his code should be reviewed like the rest of ours. In his mind, that meant I didn't trust him. Now, there were 3 of us that were all peers on that team. He had no problem with the other 2 of us getting our code reviewed. He didn't think his should be. Anytime he would open a review, because that was our team's process, he would call one of the junior devs and say, hey, I just opened it, could you go accept that? And so the fact that I would dare suggest that his code needed reviewed like the rest of ours was tantamount to telling everybody that he's not trustworthy and writes terrible code. It's just not the case. All right, what about this one? That code reviews are primarily about finding bugs. I had a guy, at one point he was working on our solution from outside of our team, and he opened a review for the work he had done, and we had a couple comments on it. One place he had violated single responsibility. We asked him to fix that. But the bigger thing we were asking for is we had one pattern that we had established for all the rest of these services he was working in, and he had flipped that pattern around. So we said, hey, could you just keep it in line with what we're doing everywhere else? It would have been maybe 10 minutes of work for him, but he threw a fit. He avidly refused, and he directly told me, when you find a bug, you can come and talk to me then. Until then, get out of my face. What ultimately happened was he had admin rights in our source control system, and he just pushed his merge right past our rejection of that review. See, if you think that a code review is just about finding bugs, you are going to be missing out on the majority of the feedback you need. Now, I'm actually going to argue later that finding bugs has almost no place in the code review process. You might disagree, but that's where I'm going to land. And even if you want it to be part of the process, you have to recognize that that is not the point of the process. It might be a side effect, but it is not what you're there for, or you are going to be missing out on a lot of the important feedback you need. What about this one? That a code review is good to merge as soon as it's accepted. Now, honestly, this kind of ties back if you view this as just a formality, that, yeah, you're probably not going to you're going to just be looking for it to get accepted. But I'll tell you what, I have developers, I know if I include them on a code review, it will be accepted inside of 37 seconds. They are diligent about as soon as that Outlook pop-up comes up, they're like, cool, boom, accepted. I could have 3 files or 33, and it is done immediately. And there is no way they have ever reviewed a single one of my code reviews. If you're actually looking to get value, you're not just looking to check that box so you can merge. You're waiting for the actual feedback. I've got guys that I know if I include them on a review and they accept it, I'm good. because they are diligent and they are careful. And then I have those people that you know what? You accepted it, and that's all great. I'm going to wait for somebody else. Right? If we're looking for the value, expect the feedback and wait until you can actually get the value you need. All right, what about this one? Code reviews are just suggestions that I can choose to follow or ignore. Right? This is my code. And if you have some thoughts on it, like I'll hear you out maybe. But this is my code, not yours. That in and of itself is a misunderstanding. Because let me tell you, you might have written it. That is not your code. Or very rarely is that ever your code. That is your team's code. That is your company's code. And just because maybe you're the sole developer on that feature today, that does not mean you're not going to get a higher paying job tomorrow. That does not mean you're going to be the one on call at 2 a.m. when I'm trying to diagnose this production issue. And I have to understand what's going on in this code. This is your team's code. Now that doesn't mean you have to just blindly take every suggestion that somebody throws out in a code review. But it does mean that you cannot just reject everything or decide, no, I don't want to mess with that one. Right? You have to, at the very least, hear people out and take what they say seriously, because this is not your code. This is your team's code and your company's code. Now, if you're the CEO, I guess you could do that, but I don't think most of us are. All right, what about here? So these last ones are ones that, you know, it's kind of a different level of it. Again, these are very well-intentioned. Code reviews are unnecessary if you pair program. The idea being, you just need 2 sets of eyes on the code. And if you've paired, you've already gotten 2 sets of eyes. You don't need that 3rd set now from a review. But, now, I'm a big advocate for pair programming. I really enjoy it. Not one of the people who wants to do it 100% of my time, but I really enjoy it. I think there's a lot of value. I don't think it replaces a good code review. Right? There are still things you're going to miss when you're pairing that you're going to miss if you're running solo. There are still those times you're going to leave that debug statement in somewhere else and it just gets swept up in your changes. There's still times that because you're kind of have tunnel vision on what you're implementing, you're going to add something to a service that really it belongs over somewhere else. Those things still happen. You still need that external feedback. But there's another piece of feedback that we need even more that you don't get from pair programming, and it comes along with this next one. Right? The idea that code reviews are more effective when they're done in person rather than online. You know, instead of on TFS or Git or wherever else, right, and typing back and forth, hey, can you make this? Well, okay, I made that change. Well, not what I meant. How about this? Nope, 3rd time, 4th time. Right? Instead of this long back and forth where maybe you're misunderstanding, you just sit down together, you hash out your issues, maybe you come to that code together and you've solved it, you're great. Again, something that has a lot of value or could have a lot of value, but it doesn't replace a good non-in-person code review. And here's why. I'm guessing I'm not the only person who's ever had this experience, but I have many times been in an engineering class or a math class, right? And the teacher, the professor is going over how to do the problem, and I'm following along, great, like everything is solid. Then 20 minutes after class, I crack the book to do the homework, and I'm looking at the first problem, and it's just like, I have no idea where to start. Like, this made complete sense when they were walking me through it. I was golden, but now that I'm on my own, I have no idea where to start. So you walking me through this, I might be able to follow what you're saying, but what about in 6 months when I have to make a feature change in here and you're not there to walk me through it? Or if you're like me, if it's been 3 weeks since I wrote a line of code, it might as well have been somebody else. I have no recognition that I ever wrote that code if it was more than 3 weeks ago. So what about that? Am I going to be able to read and understand what's going on here when we need to come back and work on this? And this is one of the most valuable pieces of feedback that you need and that you miss if you just take pair programming or those in-person code reviews. How workable is this system going to be for our team in a month, in 6 months, in a year? Because this is a living document. We are going to be working in this code base. And I don't care how well I can understand it when you walk me through it. How well can I understand it when you don't? And that's one of the big things you get when you have those kind of more anonymous code reviews. All right, and my last misconception on the list here is that code reviews are best when you have a long checklist of things to look for. Right? I don't know if you guys have been handed these checklists before. They're generally very well intentioned. A lot of times somebody higher up in the dev org says, you know, we got a lot of junior engineers, or maybe there's things slipping through that we think should have been caught. So you go to your principals or your seniors, and you say, what do you guys look for in a code review? And you get this big brain dump of all the things that their 30 years of experience tell them they would look for. And you take that and you hand it to your junior engineers, the idea being, we have just empowered you to do a code review like a principal. You're welcome. But what's the reality? The reality is that you have just overwhelmed them into non-action. I think of this like when I first drove. I got my permit, and my mother took me to the local community college. And I'm slowly driving up and down that parking lot, and she says, hey, I want you to turn out onto the road. This little 10-mile-per-hour service road that goes around the campus. I remember that as being the single most stressful moment of my entire life, right? I have to turn, and there's a stop sign. But I have to keep my foot on the gas until I get closer to the stop sign. But at some point, I have to transition to the brake, but not too soon, or I'm not going to stop at the stop sign. And I have to turn my blinker on at some point. But if it's too soon, somebody might think I'm going to turn down this parking lot. I have to wait. But if I do it too late, they won't know I'm turning. And I'm looking in this mirror, and that mirror, and that mirror, and I got to look down here. I think I completely missed the stop sign. It was just so much input, I couldn't handle it all. Now, a couple decades later, that's all second nature. I don't give a single thought to it when I'm driving. But at the time, it was so overwhelming, I couldn't handle it. And that's what happens when you hand these giant lists off to somebody who's not ready for it. It's not, they look at that, and if they're being honest, what they're going to say is, I can maybe keep like 3 or 5 of these things in my head at a time as I'm going through a code review. So if you give me a list of 50, 70 things, I have to do a code review 15, 20 times before I can say I've actually checked off this list. What happens is not that people start going through the code reviews 15 or 20 times. What happens is they conclude, this isn't for me. Right? That second misconception comes into play. Oh, this is for the more experienced developers, not for me. I'll get there, but not today. And so by doing this, you really set your dev org up for failure in this by communicating to your junior engineers, this is above your pay grade. Wait till you can understand this, and then it'll be you. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the misconceptions I run into most often, and I'm guessing they're misconceptions that either you run into or maybe you hold or have held. I know I've held a number of these. And when we hold to these and we don't really think through the implications of them, they have a tendency to just suck any value or a lot of the value we're going to be otherwise getting out of our process. So, if that's not what we want in a code review, what should we be looking for? What are our priorities for a good code review? And I like to keep it simple. I have 4. I really want it to be 3. Most of the time it's 3, but we have a kind of sometimes 4th I'm obligated to throw in. So what are my priorities? First and foremost, above all else, is readability. How readable is the code? Second is design and organization. Third, unit test quality and coverage. And most of the time it's not even there, but every once in a while it has to be included sometimes, is functionality. All right, so let's talk down through these. I put readability first and foremost above all else as the most important aspect of a code review. This is king. Your code needs to be readable if it's going to be workable. The standard I always hold my team to, I say that my wife should be able to read your code. And she knows nothing about software. At one point, so when we were on our first date, she learned I was a software developer and trying to impress me. She was like, oh, so do you do like HTML or like binary? And it was one of those, oh, that's cute kind of moments. But the reality is, like, that's her level of understanding of what I do for a living. So we decided to put this to the test. I took my laptop home one night and I sat down with her and I said, hey, can you tell me what this does? She said, of course not. I don't read code. I said, just give it a try. And it was super validating because she could read down through it and tell me exactly what it was doing. It was kind of cool. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, every single time, I would rather have readable code that doesn't work than perfectly working code I can't read. I'm going to say that again because I want to make sure we're on the same page. Every time, I would take readable code that doesn't work over perfectly working code I can't read. And here's why. You bring me readable code that you can't figure out why it's not working, we can easily sit down together, read it, understand it, and figure out what's going on. But you bring me perfectly working code I can't read, that might be fine for today, but what about next month when product asks for a feature change in that code? And now we have to get into it to understand it. What happens at 2 a.m. when I'm trying to solve that production issue, and I have to read your code to know that it's not the issue? See, if I can't read your code, I can't work in your code. And if your code's part of the system I'm responsible for maintaining, that means I can't maintain the system that I'm supposed to be maintaining. Readability is king. And what that means is, if the most junior person on your team cannot read your code, that is your problem, not theirs. Right? If the intern that's still in college, or the person straight out of college or straight out of one of those tech programs, and this is their first hour on a real job, if they cannot read your code, that is your problem, not theirs. I have worked with some absolutely brilliant developers. And guys who write code that you're just like, it is so far over my head, I have no idea what's going on. Brilliant, brilliant guys. They write stuff that looks like it should be in the Linux compiler, right? Or, yeah, I just have no idea what's going on here. But that's a problem. You know, they have this attitude of like, well, I understand it, and maybe you just need a little more experience. Maybe you need to be a little more diligent practicing stuff for the next 15 years, and then you'll be able to understand it too. But here's the problem, right? This isn't your code. This is your team's code. And that junior engineer on your team is going to be potentially taking feature lead on that feature that's going to touch your code. And if they can't read it, that's a problem, because they can't work in that code. So if the most junior person on your team cannot read your code, that is your problem to fix, and it is not their problem. Now, I get there are times when, you know, things are messy, and there's no real clean, readable, easy way to implement that thing. But there's things, right? You package it up, you stick it off to the side, you kind of hide it behind a well-named method, so at least it's clear what it's doing. But you can't just leave it out to infect the rest of your code. Readability is king. A readable code base is a workable code base. And the great thing about that is, when readability is our top priority, this lets everybody, from your most junior to your most senior person, act in a meaningful way within a code review space. Right? You can give reasonable and meaningful feedback regardless of your experience level. It also means the more experienced you are, the more you need that feedback from your junior developers. See, the further you get in your career, the more experience you have, the more you understand those esoteric things and can write that crazy code, the more grounding and humbling you need. The more you need to understand, oh yeah, this isn't a workable solution for anybody with less than 10 years of experience. And guess what? Over the next months and years, that code is going to be maintained by people who don't have the same experience and understanding you do. So the further you get in your career, the more you need that feedback to tell you, hey, you're getting to a place where we can't understand what you're doing. And we need that so that we can write a code base that is workable for the whole team. So far and away, above all else, readability is the most important priority in a code review. Second is design and organization. Now, this is both, right? Are you following objectively good design principles? Right? Are you meeting your solid design principles? Are you keeping single responsibility? Is your code dry? Are you using proper, inversion of control? Right? All of just kind of are you following best practices from a design standpoint? But there's also the more subjective. Is it well organized and designed within the project or the solution you're working? Right? If everything else is done one way and you're going to flip the script, you better have a darn good reason for that. Because when I go to that code, if everything else, I know where to find it, I know how to get to it, but then I'm not going to be able to work in your stuff because where is it? Where'd it go? Why is it backwards? And if I'm expecting it to follow one structure, then I'm going to be put out when I try to work in it. It's not. Now think about this. If you just follow these two priorities, readability and design and organization, now you shouldn't stop there, but let's say you do, you have a very workable solution. Think about that. It's well designed and organized. You can find what you're looking for. And it's readable. When you find it, you understand it, and you can work in it. This is a workable, maintainable, extensible code base. Now, you need your third priority for assurance, but those first two priorities alone will add significant value to your code base. But our third priority, also very important, unit test quality and coverage. Now, what do I mean by quality? I got two things in mind here. On the one hand, are you testing what you say you're testing? Right? Whatever your title of your unit test is that reflected by what you're actually validating? And then two, are you testing it sufficiently? Maybe you're checking the ID on a return object, but really you should be checking a full, some of the other properties going on there. Right? Are you testing what you say you're testing, and are you testing it sufficiently? And if so, then the next question is, how's your code coverage? Do you have your logic fully covered by your unit tests? And I'm not going to do this check manually. Right? Use the tools for that. If your Visual Studio has a built-in analyzer, if you're running, I think it's just Enterprise, I don't think Professional has it. But even if you don't have it in Visual Studio or whatever your IDE is, right, you have tools like SonarQube, which if you've never used, you should go check it out. SONARQUBE. Google it now, so it's up later for your phone. Like it'll change the way you code. But it's a static analysis tool, and it looks at your code, and it can tell you about bugs and potential security vulnerabilities and all this. But one of the things it does really well is identify your code coverage. And it will give you granularity to say, hey, you've got 3 conditions to get into this if block, and you've only got covered 2 of them. Well, I want to know that, because I can say, hey, you missed a test here. Because if your tests are quality, you're covering everything you say you're covering, and you're covering it sufficiently, and you have full coverage, I'm done. Right? I don't need to check your functionality. I'm not looking for bugs, because if you added a bug, you did it on purpose. Not that you tried to implement a bug into the system, but you misunderstood something because you specifically wrote the code to work a certain way, and then you wrote a test to codify that it is working the way that you thought it should be working. So this was like a double assurance that this is what you intended to do. I don't need to dig through that and try to figure out, okay, is there some other way that maybe the analyzer completely missed, that you could have screwed something up? No, and that's why I say looking for bugs doesn't really have a place in most code reviews. Because if your code is readable, if it's well designed and organized, and you've got quality unit tests and full coverage, I'm done. That is a code base I can read. It's a code base I can find what I'm looking for. And it's a code base I can make changes with assurance that I didn't affect something I didn't intend to. Right? Your unit test quality and coverage lets me make those changes with assurance. That is a workable code base. That is a maintainable code base, and that is setting you and your team up for success going forward. So those are my 3 priorities. I said I added a 4th sometimes priority, and that's because most of the time you don't need to check functionality. The only reason I have this included in here at all is there are times that you can't cover what you need to cover with a unit test. I'm one, I like to shoot for 100% coverage, but there are times when you have to use that static XML parser, you can't mock out, and I had one time I was legitimately reading a byte array into an XML that then I had to get the 64,000 some odd character out of it to the whatever, and there was just no clean, easy way we could write in a unit test for this. And when that happens, right, that's where this functionality check comes in. You are going to have to do a manual okay, let me look through, and is what we're doing make sense? But that should be the exception. Now, for me, I'm on the automation side of the house now. It's a lot more common. Most of my code reviews are the functionality side because, right, hey, is this workflow, the UI workflow we're following, does that make sense? Or do the retry policies that we've implemented around these web controls for that validation, are those reasonable retry policies that our tests are going to be solid and not failing constantly? So there is a place for that functionality check. But most of the time, it doesn't have, a normal life of development, there should be no functionality check. It should be readability, design and organization, and unit test quality and coverage. And if you make those your priorities, you teach your people to keep those very simple priorities, then what that means is every member of your team, regardless of their level of experience, can contribute in a meaningful way to the code of every other person on that team. Now, a lot of people want to flip this. Right? A lot of people want to put functionality at the top and say that is what's important. But here's the thing, you are just not nearly as good as the tooling at finding those issues. So don't waste your time. If you're doing that, and this is why I say, stop wasting your time on code reviews. If you're doing these things kind of out of order, you're spending a lot of your time on things that you don't need to be spending your time on, and you're not going to be getting nearly the value you could be getting. And so that time is wasted time. All right, so we keep these priorities, and I guarantee you're going to see your code base start to change and become a lot more workable. And the more consistent that code base becomes, the more readable, the more workable it becomes, the less likely you're going to introduce bugs, the quicker turnaround time you're going to have when you do introduce a bug, the higher your velocity is going to be, because you're going to find this is just an easier system to work in and maintain, and I can have a higher level of assurance when I do have to make those changes. So those are my priorities, and that's it. So from here, the rest of the time I want to just talk about some practical tips. What does it look like to implement these in a kind of more practical day-to-day way? And tip number one is to remember that a code review is a conversation. Right? It's not just some anonymous tool. This is a back and forth conversation with people that you trust and that you work with. And so I've got 4 kind of subpoints to that. And the first one is, because this is a conversation, take the time to explain yourself. Right? I see all the time that somebody will put a comment like, hey, could you rename BN to business name? And then, oh yeah, I can do that, cool. The next day, what are you going to be asking for in that next code review? Hey, could you rename CA to customer address? Why? Because you've told them what you want them to do, but you haven't given them the tools to understand why you're asking for that change. You know, I think of it like this. You know, the proverb I'm sure we've all heard, you give a man a fish, you feed him for the day. You teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. The idea being, if I put in that little bit of time up front to enable you and empower you, then I'm not going to be the one having to provide for you every single day. And so if I can help you understand why I'm asking for what I'm asking for, I empower you to make those decisions on your own. And I set you up for success, and I save my time going forward. You know, so instead of, hey, could you rename BN to business name, maybe it's, hey, it's better to not use abbreviations in variables and methods and class names, because not everybody has the same context for those abbreviations. And even if it's clear when you say BN equals get business name, that doesn't mean that when you use BN down the line, it's going to be clear in that context what it means. So instead of BN, could you rename this to business name? What you have just done, though it takes a little bit more of your time, is taught whoever it is you're working with to think like a more experienced developer than they currently are. You have given them the groundwork for that, and what happens is not that people just go along. It's kind of like what I was describing at the beginning. It's not that people just go along because you've given them a checklist, but once people understand the rationale, that just kind of weasels its way into their brain, and it incorporates itself into their thinking. And so people don't have to make this mental checklist, because that's just how they approach and how they think about things going forward. Now, when we have people join our team, a lot of times some of those first code reviews are upwards of 70 to 100 comments back and forth. And that sounds like a lot. And honestly, it is a lot. But what normally happens after that is that within 1 or 2 code reviews, we have almost nothing to say. Right? And again, it's not because these people have developed a long checklist of all the things that we've demanded, or because we have some code standards document that we've told them to go memorize. It's because they have said, oh yeah, that makes sense. And they've started thinking as like a more experienced developer than they are, and they start incorporating those ideas and those things into the way that they write day in and day out. So the most helpful thing you can do for especially the more junior people on your team is to explain yourself and explain why you're asking for what you're asking for. And to be honest, there's times too when I will go out of my way to explain myself on a review for somebody that's more senior than me, or that I know knows it. Because if there are more junior people on that code review, now they don't have to make the same mistake. Right? Even if you understand it, and I could just say, hey, you missed this, could you go fix that? Now all of the other people who are on that review can read that and say, oh, great point, I'll remember that for next time. And your whole team comes along faster for it. So that's the first point. Explain yourself. The second part of this is to remember that you are not always right, and that is okay. Somebody asking you to change something, asking you to fix something, is not an attack on your person. It's not an assault on your honor. You don't need to defend yourself or why you made that choice you did. We're all going to make mistakes. That just happens, and it's okay. And when it comes up, you just say, oh, yeah, thanks for the heads up, and you fix it. The more defensiveness you bring into the code review process, the harder it's going to be to get value out of it. But as much as it's important to remember you're not always right, it's also important to recognize that it is okay to disagree, because you're also not always wrong. There are things that are objectively wrong in our world. There are things that, if you misspelled something, you need to fix that. If you left in the to-do statement that you implemented, you just forgot to take it out, you need to remove that to-do statement. There are things that are objectively wrong. There's other things that are subjective. There are times that you're going to disagree, and neither of you is right. I had this a handful of months ago now. I was writing some automation for an API, and I had included all the developers working on the API. And one of the principal developers, he was looking over my test, and he said, hey, I don't think you need to be checking the text of the error messages returned from these. I think just checking the error codes is enough. And I came back and I said, well, actually, I think we do need to check the text, because by exposing it, even if we don't intend to, we're making that part of our contract. Because I don't know about you guys, I have certainly consumed error messages when error codes didn't give me the granularity I wanted. And then I've been bit because those error messages got changed. But he disagreed, and he came back and he was like, well, I think it makes it too brittle. And he explained himself. And I hit him up offline in Teams, and I said, hey, I'm glad we're having this conversation, but I want to make sure we keep it over in GitHub. Because we had 5 junior developers on that code review. And he and I were going back and forth, not demanding I want this, but explaining how we were thinking about this problem, and we were coming to 2 different conclusions. But that disagreement is an opportunity to learn one another's perspectives and to allow our own thinking to be changed by that understanding that somebody else is bringing to the table. We ultimately never agreed. And that was a time when I had to play the, well, I'm the one responsible for this, and so I'm going to do it my way card. There's other times, though, that we need the humility to play the I don't agree, and I'm going to do it your way card. Right? Again, this is not my code. This is our code. And we need to treat it as our code. Right? If you can't come to an agreement, there's times you just take it to the team and say, hey, we're not on the same page. What do you guys want? Because this is our code. And I've been on the winning side of that, and I've been on the losing side. And when you're on the losing side, you just need to say, okay, I don't agree, but I'll go you guys' way. So it is okay to disagree. And the last one here, and remembering that it is a conversation, is that it might take more than one round. A lot of people will treat a code review as though you're just taking a box of comments. It's like waterfall, right? You just throw it over the wall. And now your developer can go and fix those things, and then it goes on its way. But I don't know about you guys. I've gone through code reviews where I'm like, okay, I got a couple small comments, and then realize, oh, actually this method is just in the whole wrong class. This needs to go maybe into that common project, or maybe by adding it, we've bloated this class too much, we need to break it apart. Well, if I'm asking for those kind of high-level refactorings, that's going to be really inconvenient if I've also got 100 small comments that now you have to either fix before you refactor, or you lose them when they get. And so you just ask for that high-level refactoring. They do that work, and then you can go back through and do a more detailed review. But I've had it before where you do that. They do their refactorings, somebody else accepts the review, and you haven't even looked at the code. They just said, cool, I addressed those comments, and somebody else accepted, so I'm good to go. Don't merge just because you address the comments. Make sure the people who are engaged in that conversation have the chance to actually give it the second look. Because if we are expecting value, we want the value from the people who are engaged in that review. And so make sure you're getting it. So that's maybe the most important practical tip. Not maybe, that is the most important practical tip. Remember, this is a conversation, and take it as such, and actually engage with the people you're talking to. All right, tip number 2 is to recognize that not everybody has the same role in your code review. And as such, we need to make sure that we have all the roles we need covered. Now, what do I mean by roles? Right? When I'm coming to a review, there's different things, there's different expertise, and different feedback I need. Again, if I'm looking for value, if this is not just a formality, if I'm looking for value, I want the people who can give me the most valuable feedback. And so, again, I'm on the automation side. There are plenty of times, if I'm writing automation for an actively developing feature, of course I'm going to include the feature devs on that code review. Now, I don't expect them to know and understand the finer points of our Selenium service implementation. I don't expect them to know how I've implemented the backend service layer that drives our test projects. Now, if they want to give me feedback, I'm always open to it. But I don't expect them to. I do expect them to be the experts on the tests I'm writing and on the features that I'm testing. Right? They're the ones that are going to be able to tell me, oh, hey, we also added a check that's going to strip out dashes in that text field. So you need to make sure you add a test for dashes. Now, I need that feedback. I need them. They're the ones that can tell me, am I testing the right things and am I testing it sufficiently? But that's not enough feedback, because I need somebody who can give me that feedback on the implementation side of things, right? And so I'm the only automation engineer on my team, but I've got guys I work with that I trust and that know this system, and I can say, hey, I'm adding you to this review. And they can give me the feedback on how I have actually implemented the test, even if they don't understand the requirements that I'm testing. Right? I've got people who are validating the testing and the requirements, and I got somebody who's validating my implementation. Other times, if I'm doing higher level service stuff, I'm going to include an architect or track down somebody I trust, and I can say, hey, I want your input on some of these higher level changes I'm making. Can you help me out here? If you're looking for value, make sure you have the people who can give you the value you need and get that feedback. And then wait to merge until all your roles have signed off. And this might sound obvious, but it's easily forgotten, right? You're like, oh, I'm in a hurry, and oh, somebody accepted it. And you forget that, oh, wait, I needed dev, automation, and architectural feedback, and I've gotten maybe dev and automation feedback. I still need my architect. So wait, if you're looking for the value, wait until you have the value you're looking for before you merge. And kind of following from that, right, not everybody always has time. But make sure you double check with your pending reviewers before you merge. There are times when I've had somebody, I was most of the way through a review, and then it got closed out because somebody else had accepted it, and they never bothered to say, hey, is anybody still doing this? And there's other times, though, where it's, hey, I really want that feedback from the principal engineer, but he's working that production issue, and he's not going to be able to give me feedback today. So maybe see if I can find somebody else to cover that role. There's times where you just kind of got to merge past some of that. But again, if we are looking for the feedback, ask for the feedback you need. And this is not a checklist, right? This would be very wrong-headed if you took from this, okay, every time I do a review, I need architectural feedback, and I need dev feedback, and I need QA feedback, and right, that's not the point. A lot of what you implement doesn't need all that feedback. A lot of times, I'm just like, oh yeah, I need one person I trust to give me a review of this. What are you doing? And who do you need based on what you're doing? Right? That's the question to ask. So that's tip number 2. Not everyone has the same role, but you want to make sure you have the roles you need covered. Tip number 3, use the tools at your disposal. Don't waste your time on things you don't need to do. There are things that you are really good at that the tools are not. The tools cannot tell you how readable this code is. The tools cannot tell you how well designed and organized this code is. And the tools cannot tell you how quality those unit tests are. So let the tools, though, do the things they're good at, and you spend your time on the things the tools can't. I mentioned SonarQube earlier. I love Sonar. Sometimes I sound brilliant in code reviews because I'm the only person that looks at the Sonar results. I'm going and I'm like, oh, hey, this is a potential security vulnerability and this thing. Or, hey, this is a possible thread safety issue for this. And people are like, oh, man, how did you even know that? And I'm like, yeah, just. But the reality is I just went to Sonar and looked at the analysis that it spit out, and I'm using the tools at my disposal. Don't waste your time trying to track down through things that you can get for free. You spend your time on the things the tools can't do, and let the tools do what they're good at. So that's tip number 3. And my final tip is to do your own review. This is the mistake a lot of people make. You can do everything else well, and it just wastes people's time. And I'm not talking do an exhaustive review here. But when you open that review, when you open that PR, crack open the file diff that everybody else is going to be looking at. Right? Take a look and say, oh, wait, why is that file in there? I didn't mean for that file to be here. And remove it before anybody else has to tell you to. I had one time I opened a review, somebody added a project. There were 3 files in this project. And so I expected, 4 or 5 files, including a project file, a solution file. There were 53 files in this review. And I was like, what is going on? He forgot the git ignore. But if he had looked at that, he would have said, I didn't check in 53 files, what's going on? And that's where we need to take that step back. You do your own review. Take the time, take the 30 seconds, look and say, is this reasonable? Is this what I'm expecting to be here? And set your team up for success so you're not wasting their time having to go through everything you've got. So seriously, just do it. Take the time. And that is what I've got. I really do believe that a good code review process is the most valuable thing that you could implement on your team. And it will dramatically change the way you and your team code. It empowers your junior developers to start operating high above their experience and their level. And it sets your whole team up for success in crafting a code base that is going to be highly workable for the foreseeable future, because recognize you are going to be working in that code base for a long time to come, you or somebody else. So stop wasting the time and let's make good use of it, right? 3 priorities: readability, design and organization, unit test quality and coverage. Keep those in mind and you set yourself up for success. All right, that is what I've got. We do have a few minutes for questions. I don't know if anybody's got, yeah.
What are some tools that you would recommend to use the tools available to you? What are some tools that we can use so that we don't have to do it ourselves?
All right, so the question is, what are some of the tools that I say to use? Now, that kind of depends on what language you're working in or what stack, but honestly, the big things, I mean, use your IDE. You know, I regularly, I work mostly in .NET, but I will regularly, when I'm doing a code review, I don't do it in TFS or in GitHub. I actually crack the code open because guess what Visual Studio does for me? It grays out the unused using statements that got left in there. It green underlines all of the silly things they did, and people are just ignoring those. Right? Obviously, like I'm working out of the same IDE as them. Take the time, when I'm opening a review, I'm going to go back through the files that I'm checking in my IDE and make sure that my IDE is not flagging anything obvious that I can fix before I check this in. So that's one. I called out SonarQube. That is like my absolute favorite tool that exists ever. And if you aren't using it, you should. And it will tell you just about everything you could want to know. You can add different, linting tools and whatnot to your process, and that can add a lot of value. But yeah, a lot of that's going to be somewhat dependent on the tech stack you're working in. Yeah.
Is there ever value to having in-person code review meetings?
Yeah. So the questions is there value to in-person code reviews rather than online? And yes. And that's kind of where there's a bit of a balance here. A lot of these things, just kind of like pair programming, there is value to be had there. And especially, there's times where maybe you're standing up a new service architecture, and so you want to do that in-person review with your team to walk them through, like, hey, this is what we're going to be working in going forward. And sometimes that kind of a thing is really invaluable. But where I stand is I don't think it replaces that kind of differentiated code review, because that in-person does not tell you how workable this is going to be, from an anonymous standpoint later on down the road. And that, from my experience, that is the single most valuable piece of feedback you're going to get, because that is what tells you whether you are going to be able to work in the system for the long haul. All right, I cannot see this light. All right, I see a hand up there.
Do you have an opinion on scheduled code review, or like my team has a daily scheduled meeting that as a team, whoever is available will collectively do a code review of whatever PRs are in. Do you have any thoughts on whether that seems like a good structure, or if you intend to use a more flexible one, benefits, cons thereof?
Yeah. So the question is, what about a scheduled time for code reviews? Is that valuable? Like setting aside a block of time that we work on open PRs then. So valuable and not would be my answer. I've done that, at times where on a team we kind of had an hour set aside. Essentially, we said after stand-up, if there is anything open, that is your top priority to go do those. But my preference is always to do them as we go, right? You keep your PRs as small as possible. And when you get in this groove, this is one of the great things, right? It takes a long time to do some of these reviews up front when there's a lot of comments to make. But the more cohesive you become, the more consistent your team is operating, the quicker those reviews get. And a lot of times, there's little to no feedback. So if you have a small PR and we're all operating with the same kind of base level of understanding, I can crack that open, be like, boom, boom, boom. No, we're good, accepted, and you're good. The problem comes when either you have these massive PRs or when you don't have that shared understanding, and there's a lot of back and forth that has to take place. So I don't want to interrupt the process. If I check this in, if it's ready to go, I want that instantaneous feedback. And so if you keep PRs small and can work them, but other times your head's down on an issue and you're not going to be able to get to it. And so there can be value to having that time that if you haven't gotten to it yet, you get to it now. So I think it's one of those you kind of have to figure out what works for your team. And the more consistent you get with this process, the more some of those things will flush out, with what your team finds valuable.
We've got a daily schedule, so.
Yeah. All right, got a question up here?
So kind of related to that, do you have any advice on encouraging people to do more reviews? So you had mentioned at the very beginning mandatory comments, and on my team I feel like we need something like that to encourage everybody to do more reviews.
So the question is, do I have any advice on kind of getting people to actually engage with this process? And to some extent, I would say that as much as it is a very management-y solution to say everybody has to comment on everybody else's review, it works. Now, I will never suggest that as a long-term thing, because especially as you come together on this and as you're doing these regularly, you will find there is not a lot to say on a lot of code reviews. And there were times where that was my comment on a review. It was just a couple files, and I looked at it and was like, yeah, there's nothing to say here. And so my comment was, this looks good, I have nothing to say. And that's fine, unless somebody else is putting 30 comments on that, and it's clearly not fine, and I just skipped over it. And that's part of one of those, like, it's a self-policing team, where I think it can be good to say, for the time being, for the next sprint, everybody does have to put a comment on every code review, or you have to comment on at least 3 code reviews. I don't know, depends on what you're doing. But having that kind of enforced thing up front gets people into the groove. And as you get into the groove, you start to realize value. And once you realize value, you don't have to keep people in the groove because they want to be there. Right? That's the whole reason I'm doing this presentation today, is because I have gone from a place where I saw no value to I see it so valuable, I want you to experience this too. So there's no way I would ever sacrifice that on my teams. It's not because I have to do code reviews, it's because I need that feedback. And so I do think it could be a good idea to say, for a time box, a sprint, a month, whatever it is, we are going to have this requirement on our developers. Let them experience the value and take it from there as you go. So it's not something I would ever suggest long term, but it can be a good stopgap. All right, we got anything else? Looks like we got one up here in the middle.
Okay, so this is more of a soft skills question, but I'm a senior developer. I'm guilty of some of the misconceptions, and I was wondering if you have any advice on how to bring this to your group of newer devs or something without it feeling too micromanaging. I think you talked about it a little bit.
Yeah, so the question is, if we aren't doing this, how do we bring this in without it being micromanaging? And I guess the thing I would say is saying, hey, this is something we need to do. Honestly, it's just good practice. It doesn't have to be micromanaging to say we're going to review each other's code. Now, I've seen places where it is very micromanaging because it's not we are going to review each other's code. It's all of you have to submit your code reviews to me for me to do them. Right? And that's that, like, hey, the senior gives the feedback, or the trustworthy developer gives the feedback, but I don't expect anything in return. And so that's where it becomes, in my mind, problematic, and you set the really the wrong standards of what should be going on, and you lose a lot of value doing that. But if it's hey, I need your feedback on my code as much as I want to give my feedback to yours, then I think you can just go and say, hey, this is something we're going to try. I want to give this a go. I'd like us all to participate. Maybe you do need to say, for the time being, yeah, we are going to all comment on all of these to make sure we're giving it a college try. But setting that standard doesn't have to be micromanaging, especially if it's a group consensus that this is value I want from you guys, as well as value I want to offer you. All right, we got about 1 minute left. So we have maybe like one more question up here. Okay, we got a waving hand in the light. So the question is, if there's a bug downstream, you're talking like after a code review process is done, or something that's found during that process? So a bug is found after the fact. How does that get back to the developer? That I would say would be, I guess, kind of to some extent out of the scope of this process, because it would take place after. So that's really dependent on more so how your team is structured. You know, I would say then you're opening a ticket in your ticketing system, and it kind of falls into story work depending on severity and all of that. But now if it's found during the code review process, that's a whole different story, right? That's, again, in my view, that's not the point of a review, but certainly sometimes you're going to run into those things as part of the review, and they should be fixed in the course of that work. But something outside of that, I think it's really going to fall more under your company systems. All right, we are at time. Thank you guys for coming. I hope you got something out of this.